Blood is supposed to be thicker than water. But in the winter of 1342, when the cold carved through bone and hunger turned loyalty into something fragile and negotiable, blood became nothing more than a currency. And in the Iron Peak pack, it was spent without hesitation, because survival had become more important than family, more important than honor, and certainly more important than a forgotten girl who had never once been treated like she belonged. And so on a night where the wind howled like a warning through the cracked stone walls of their dying fortress, Gwendalyn learned exactly what her life was worth. Not in love, not in protection, but in sacks of grain and the promise of one more season of survival for men who had already lost everything that made them worthy of being called leaders, because Gareth and Leofric, the twin alphas of Iron Peak, were not kings but scavengers dressed in titles they had neither earned nor deserved, and their rule had bled the pack dry, leaving behind nothing but desperation, starvation, and fear. And in the shadows of the great hall, where the fire struggled to stay alive and the air reeked of decay, a deal was struck that would echo far beyond that frozen night, though none of them understood it yet. Not even the girl whose fate had just been sealed without her voice ever being heard, because Gwendalyn, the so-called runt, the unshifted disgrace, the unwanted daughter of a second mate long buried and forgotten, was not present in the negotiation as a person but as an object, a solution, a sacrifice. And when the emissary from Shadowpine spoke her existence aloud, when Lord Reginald calmly reminded the twins that they did in fact possess one last piece of royal blood to trade, the silence that followed was not one of hesitation but calculation, and in that silence Gwendalyn, hidden just beyond the door with trembling hands pressed against her mouth, prayed for something she should have known better than to expect. She prayed for mercy, for recognition, for the faintest memory of shared blood to mean something. But when Gareth finally spoke, his voice cold and empty, offering her life in exchange for wheat as casually as one might discard spoiled meat, something inside her did not break the way it should have. Instead it went quiet, dangerously quiet, like a storm pulling inward before it erupts. And though tears burned her eyes and her heart pounded with a fear so deep it felt suffocating, she made no sound when they came for her, when Leofric dragged her by the hair across the stone floor while she begged, not for herself but for a chance to prove she was worth more than this, worth more than nothing. But her pleas fell into the same emptiness that had defined her entire life, and when the iron collar snapped around her throat, heavy and cold and final, she understood something with terrifying clarity. She had never been their sister. Not truly. She had only ever been something temporary, something expendable, something that could be traded the moment it became inconvenient to keep. And so she stopped begging, stopped crying, stopped hoping, and as she was thrown into the back of a supply wagon like livestock, the gates of Iron Peak closing behind her with a hollow finality, she did not look back, not because she was strong, but because there was nothing left to look at. And the journey that followed stripped away whatever illusions she still clung to, the cold biting deeper each night, the hunger gnawing, the silence of the guards broken only by the occasional cruel laughter or indifferent command. Yet through it all she endured, not because she believed she would survive, but because some quiet, stubborn part of her refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her break completely, and far beyond the frozen plains, in a kingdom carved from obsidian and ruled by a man whose name alone inspired fear, a different kind of restlessness stirred, because King Alaric, conqueror of the north, destroyer of rival packs, a man who had built his empire through blood and iron, was not at peace, not truly, because for 15 years he had been haunted by something no battle could silence, a dream that returned night after night with relentless precision, a girl running through forests that never ended, her copper hair blazing against the darkness, her scent lingering just out of reach. And no matter how fast he chased, no matter how fiercely his wolf surged forward, he never reached her, never saved her. And that failure had shaped him more deeply than any war, turning him into something colder, something harder, a king who trusted nothing but strength and feared nothing except the possibility that the one thing meant for him did not exist at all. And so when the Iron Peak caravan finally arrived at the gates of Obsidian Keep, he expected nothing more than another display of submission, another reminder of his dominance, another meaningless exchange in the endless cycle of power. But the moment she entered his hall, dragged and broken and barely standing, everything changed, because before he even saw her face, before he even understood what was happening, he felt it, a scent that cut through everything else, sharp and undeniable, like rain on stone and pine crushed underfoot, and in that instant his entire world shifted, his wolf slamming against his ribs with a force that nearly brought him to his knees, And when she was forced down before him, trembling, bruised, her head bowed beneath the weight of everything she had endured, he rose slowly, not as a king addressing a prisoner, but as something far more dangerous, something instinctual, something ancient, and when he commanded her to look at him, the room itself seemed to hold its breath, because what happened next was not just recognition, it was destiny snapping into place with terrifying precision. And as her storm-grey eyes met his, the years of searching, the endless dreams, the quiet madness of chasing a ghost all came crashing together into a single undeniable truth. She was real, she was here, and she had been delivered to him in chains. And in that moment, as rage unlike anything he had ever felt began to burn through his veins, not at her, but at those who had dared to reduce her to this, the fate of kingdoms shifted without a single sword being drawn. Because the girl they had sold for survival had just become the most powerful force in the North, and none of them, not her brothers, not his court, not even Gwendolen herself, yet understood what that truly meant. Blood may have delivered her into his hall, but it was something far more dangerous that kept King Alaric standing there, unmoving, staring at the girl before him as if the entire world had narrowed to the fragile rise and fall of her breath, because in that single moment where her storm-grey eyes met his, 15 years of relentless searching, of sleepless nights haunted by a phantom he had nearly convinced himself did not exist, collided with reality in a way that shook even a man who had never once doubted his own power. And the silence that followed was not ordinary silence, but the kind that presses down on every living thing, the kind that makes even seasoned warriors lower their gaze without understanding why, because something ancient had just awakened in their king, something none of them had ever seen before, and Gwendolen, still kneeling on the cold stone, felt it without knowing what it was. A pressure in the air so heavy it made it hard to breathe, her instincts screaming at her to flee even as her body remained frozen in place, too exhausted, too broken to do anything but tremble beneath the weight of his gaze. And when he finally moved, stepping down from his throne with slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the hall like the ticking of fate itself, every eye followed him, every breath held, because this was not the measured stride of a ruler passing judgment, this was something else entirely, something raw and dangerous. And when he stopped in front of her, so close she could see the faint scars across his knuckles and the tension in his jaw, she braced herself for pain, for punishment, for whatever cruelty a king like him might decide she deserved. But what came instead was something far more unsettling, because when he spoke, his voice was no longer the detached command of a conqueror but something lower, rougher, edged with disbelief, as if he were speaking not to a prisoner but to a miracle he was afraid might vanish if he said the wrong thing. And yet before he could act further, before instinct could fully override protocol, the world intruded in the form of Lord Reginald, who, still coughing from the force with which he had been thrown aside moments earlier, forced himself back into the center of the scene with the stubborn confidence of a man who believed he still understood the rules of the game, and his voice, though slightly strained, carried clearly as he attempted to restore order, reminding the court that the girl was nothing more than a surrendered hostage, a symbol of Iron Peak's defeat, a thing to be used, placed, controlled, and perhaps discarded when no longer useful, and in doing so, he made a mistake that would ripple through the kingdom, because he reached for her again, his hand closing around the chain of her broken dignity as if nothing had changed, as if the king had not just nearly killed him for the same act moments earlier. And when Gwendolen cried out, the sound sharp and involuntary, it triggered something far more violent than before, something that did not merely react but exploded, and Alaric moved with a speed that made it seem as though he had vanished and reappeared, his hand wrapping around Reginald's throat with such force that the man's words cut off into a strangled gasp. And this time there was no restraint, no hesitation, no pretense of control, because the look in the king's eyes was not one of anger alone but of possession, of something deeply instinctual asserting itself with terrifying clarity, and his voice when he spoke was no longer entirely human, layered with the unmistakable growl of the beast within, a warning that resonated through bone and marrow, a promise of violence so absolute that no one in that hall dared to move. And as he hurled the emissary aside once more, leaving him broken against the stone, the message was clear without needing further explanation. No one would touch her again, not without consequence. And yet, even as the hall descended into stunned silence, confusion rippling through the gathered warriors and advisors who had never seen their king behave in such a way, Alaric did something that shattered their expectations even further, because instead of returning to his throne, instead of issuing commands or explanations, He dropped to his knees in front of her, a motion so shocking, so completely at odds with everything they knew about him, that it felt almost unreal, and Gwendolen, who had braced herself for violence, for humiliation, for anything but this, recoiled instinctively, her back pressing against the nearest solid surface as her mind struggled to process what was happening, because kings did not kneel, not to prisoners, not to anyone, and yet here he was, his massive frame lowered before her, his hands hovering as though unsure whether he was allowed to touch her, and when he finally spoke, the words were so soft they might have been imagined, a confession more than a command, as he admitted that he had thought she was a ghost, and in that moment, for the first time since her capture, Gwendolen saw something in him that she had not expected. Not cruelty, not dominance, but vulnerability, raw and unguarded. And it unsettled her far more than anger ever could have, because it made no sense, because nothing about this made sense. And when he removed the remnants of the iron collar from her neck completely, breaking it as if it were nothing more than brittle wood, and wrapped her in his own cloak, the warmth of it shocking against her freezing skin, she found her voice again not in gratitude but in confusion, demanding to know why, demanding to understand what game was being played, because this had to be a game, a trick, something designed to lower her guard before delivering the true blow, but his answer, spoken clearly enough for the entire hall to hear, was not a lie she could easily dismiss, because he did not speak in riddles or half-truths. He declared it plainly, that kings do not keep their queens in chains, and the effect of those words was immediate and profound, not just on her but on everyone present, because with that single statement he had done more than free a prisoner. He had redefined her position entirely, elevating her from nothing to something that stood beside him rather than beneath him, and the tension that followed was not loud but suffocating. 1,000 unspoken questions hanging in the air as the court struggled to reconcile what they had just witnessed with everything they believed to be true, and Gwendolen, still shaking, still trying to understand how she had gone from being dragged through snow in a cage to standing wrapped in the king's own cloak, could not find solid ground in any of it, because her entire life had taught her one thing above all else, that kindness came with a cost, that protection was always conditional, that nothing was given without expectation, and yet as she was led away from the hall, not to a cell but to chambers warmer and larger than anything she had ever seen, attended by servants who treated her with a careful respect that bordered on fear, she found herself confronted with a possibility she had never allowed herself to consider, that perhaps this was not a trick, that perhaps something far more complicated, far more dangerous, was unfolding around her, something tied not to politics or strategy but to a bond she did not yet understand, and in the days that followed, as her body slowly began to recover from years of neglect, as the bruises faded and strength returned in small, fragile increments, the distance between her and the king became a tension all its own, because Alaric, who had faced armies without hesitation, now approached her with a restraint that bordered on reverence, keeping his distance even as his presence filled every space he entered, watching her as though committing every detail to memory, as though afraid that if he looked away for too long she might disappear again, and it was in those quiet moments, in the spaces between words, that the truth began to take shape, not fully understood but impossible to ignore, because the bond between them was growing, subtle at first, a thread connecting them in ways that defied explanation, and while she tried to resist it, tried to cling to the certainty that this could not be real, that she could not be what he seemed to believe she was, the world around her continued to shift in response to a reality that no longer aligned with her past, and beyond the walls of her chamber, the kingdom itself began to stir with unrest, whispers spreading through the ranks, questions forming in the minds of those who had built their loyalty on strength and tradition, because a king who claimed a broken, unshifted girl as his queen was not a narrative that fit within the rigid structure they had always known. And while Alaric might have been strong enough to enforce his will through sheer dominance, even he could not entirely silence the growing tension that threatened to fracture the stability he had spent years building. And far to the south, where the snow still buried the remnants of Iron Peak's failing lands, two brothers who had once believed themselves clever enough to trade their sister for survival began to hear whispers of their own. Whispers that the girl they had discarded was no longer a liability but something far more valuable, something that had captured the attention of the most powerful king in the north, and as that realization took root, twisting their fear into something sharper, more dangerous, the seeds of a new betrayal began to form, because men like Gareth and Leofric did not learn from their mistakes, they doubled down on them, convinced that if they had miscalculated once, They could simply correct it, manipulate it, turn it to their advantage, never once considering that the game they thought they were playing had already moved beyond their control, and that the girl they had sold was no longer a piece on the board but a force that would soon reshape it entirely. The days that followed should have felt like salvation, yet to Gwendolen they unfolded like a dream she did not trust, the kind that feels too soft, too unreal, as though it might shatter the moment she allows herself to believe in it, because everything around her had changed with a speed that left her unsteady, from the rough stone floors of the scullery to chambers warmed by roaring hearths, from tattered rags that barely shielded her from the cold to silks that brushed her skin like something meant for a life she had never imagined she could live, and yet none of it reached the part of her that had been shaped by years of neglect, because that part remained guarded, watchful, waiting for the inevitable shift when kindness would reveal itself as something else entirely, and the servants who attended her, though gentle in their actions, moved with a caution that betrayed their uncertainty, as if they were tending not to a noblewoman but to something unpredictable, something they had been told to respect but did not fully understand, and in truth they were not alone in that confusion, because the entire kingdom of Shadowpine had begun to feel the ripple effect of her presence, a quiet disturbance beneath the surface of a carefully maintained order, and at the center of it all stood King Alaric, a man whose authority had never been questioned, whose will had always been absolute, yet now found himself navigating something far more complex than war or conquest. Because power could command obedience, but it could not force understanding, and understanding was precisely what his people lacked when it came to the girl he had declared their queen. And so while Gwendolen struggled within the walls of her chamber, trying to reconcile the life she had lived with the one she had been thrust into, the court itself began to shift, alliances forming in whispers, doubts growing in silence. And among those most unsettled by this change was the Council of Elders, whose authority, though secondary to the king, carried the weight of tradition that even Alaric could not entirely ignore, and at their head stood Elder Balthazar, a man whose age had not softened his beliefs but hardened them into something rigid and unyielding, and to him, the idea of an unshifted, half-blood girl ascending to the position of Luna was not merely unconventional, it was unacceptable, a fracture in the very foundation of the order he had spent his life preserving. And so it was only a matter of time before that tension found its voice, before the quiet unease that lingered in the halls of Obsidian Keep coalesced into something more direct, more dangerous. And it began not with confrontation but with observation, with careful attention paid to every movement Gwendolen made, every word she spoke, every sign that might confirm the fears they dared not yet express openly, and what they saw did not reassure them, because she did not move like a queen, did not carry herself with the confidence or dominance they expected. Instead she moved cautiously, her steps measured, her gaze often lowered, her body language shaped by years of being taught to take up as little space as possible, and to those who did not know her past, who saw only the surface, it looked like weakness, like fragility, like something that could not possibly stand beside a king who had carved his rule through strength alone. And so the whispers grew louder, more frequent, until they reached a point where silence was no longer an option, and the council requested an audience, not as a suggestion but as a necessity, and Alaric, who had anticipated this moment from the instant he spoke the word queen in that hall, granted it without hesitation, because he knew that whatever came next would define not only his rule but the future of the bond he had only just begun to understand. And the meeting that followed was not held in secrecy but in the great council chamber, a deliberate choice that ensured every word spoken would carry weight, that every challenge would be witnessed, and Gwendolen, though not required to attend, found herself drawn to the edge of that gathering, hidden just beyond the main threshold, her presence unnoticed but her attention fixed on the voices within, because despite everything, despite the fear and the uncertainty, she needed to understand what she had been pulled into, needed to hear how the world saw her now, even if that truth was painful. And when Balthazar spoke, his voice steady and unyielding, it carried the weight of every doubt that had been building within the kingdom, not cloaked in politeness but laid bare with a bluntness that left no room for misinterpretation, as he questioned not just her suitability but the king's judgment itself, questioning how a ruler known for his precision and strength could choose a mate who had yet to shift, who bore the scent of human fragility, who had no proven lineage worthy of standing beside him. And each word, though spoken within the bounds of respect, was a challenge, a test, a line drawn that demanded response. And for a moment, a brief but palpable moment, the room held its breath, waiting to see whether Alaric would answer with diplomacy or dominance, whether he would attempt to justify his decision or simply enforce it. And when he rose, the answer became clear before he even spoke, because the air itself seemed to shift under the weight of his presence. The quiet murmur of the room silenced by the sheer force of his aura, and when his hand came down upon the heavy oak table, shattering it with a single strike, the message was unmistakable, not just in the act but in the power behind it, a reminder that whatever doubts they held, whatever traditions they clung to, none of it outweighed his authority. And his words that followed were not explanations but declarations, firm and absolute, as he made it clear that Gwendolyn was not a subject of debate but a fact of their reality, that she was their queen not because she fit their expectations but because he had chosen her, and that any further disrespect would not be tolerated, not as a difference of opinion but as defiance. And the effect of that display was immediate, the elders bowing their heads not in agreement but in submission, because, while they might question, they could not challenge, not openly, not without risking consequences none of them were prepared to face. And yet even as the confrontation ended, even as the outward appearance of order was restored, the underlying tension did not disappear, it simply shifted, becoming quieter, more insidious, because forced obedience does not breed acceptance, it breeds resistance, and Gwendolyn, standing just beyond the doorway, felt the weight of that truth settle over her like a second skin, because she understood, perhaps better than any of them, what it meant to exist in a place where you were not truly wanted, where your presence was tolerated only because it had been commanded. And as she retreated from the chamber, her thoughts heavy, her emotions tangled between gratitude and fear, she began to realize that her new life, for all its warmth and protection, came with its own kind of danger, not the immediate, physical threat she had known before, but something more complex, more enduring, the challenge of proving herself in a world that had already decided she did not belong. And as the days turned into weeks, that challenge began to take shape in subtle ways, in the glances that lingered too long, in the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, in the careful politeness that masked underlying doubt. And while Alaric remained a constant presence, his attention unwavering, his protection absolute, she could not rely solely on him, could not allow herself to become something that existed only in the shadow of his strength, because deep within her, beneath the fear and the uncertainty, something had begun to stir, faint at first, barely noticeable, like the first crack in a frozen surface, a sensation she could not name, a pull she could not explain, but one that grew stronger with each passing day, and though she did not yet understand it, though she still believed herself to be broken in the way her brothers had always claimed, the truth was beginning to emerge in quiet, undeniable ways, because her wolf was not absent, it was waiting, and the longer she remained in a place where she was seen, where she was protected, where she was given the space to exist beyond survival, the closer that truth came to the surface, setting the stage for a revelation that would not only silence the doubts of those who questioned her, but redefine everything they thought they knew about strength, power, and what it truly meant to be chosen by fate. Power does not always arrive with noise, and destiny does not always announce itself with fire and thunder. Sometimes it waits, quietly, patiently, buried beneath years of pain and silence, waiting for the exact moment when the world gives it no other choice but to rise. And for Gwendolyn, that moment came not in comfort, not in safety, but in fear, the kind of fear that strips everything down to instinct. Because even as the walls of Obsidian Keep stood tall and unshaken against the winter winds, the true threat did not come from the outside alone, it came from betrayal, from the same blood that had once sold her for survival. Because far to the south, Gareth and Leofric had made a fatal mistake. They had mistaken Alaric's restraint for weakness, his devotion for vulnerability, and their greed, sharpened by desperation and arrogance, drove them into an alliance that would either crown them in power or bury them in their own failure. And when word reached the north that the Alpha King would leave the keep for the sacred hunt, the plan was set into motion with a precision that spoke not of intelligence, but of reckless ambition, because they believed they understood the game, believed they could manipulate it, never realizing that the moment Gwendolyn had stepped into Shadowpine, the rules had already changed, and so when Alaric prepared to leave, his presence lingering in her chamber like a storm held back by sheer will, Gwendolyn felt something she could not explain. A tightening in her chest, a quiet dread that coiled around her instincts like a warning she could not ignore, and though she spoke it softly, urging him not to go, urging him to stay, to wait, to listen to something unseen, Alaric, bound by tradition and the weight of his crown, dismissed it not out of arrogance, but because he had never known fear like this before, had never felt uncertainty in the face of something he could not fight.
And so he kissed her forehead, promised to return, and
rode out into the snow, unaware that he was riding directly into a trap that had been built on betrayal and sealed with his own bloodlines past. And when the ambush came, it was not honorable, not fair, but brutal and calculated, poison cutting deeper than steel, numbers overwhelming strength. And even as he fought with the fury that had made him a legend, tearing through his enemies with claws and teeth and raw dominance,
the venom worked its way through his body, dragging him down, weakening
the very foundation of what made him unstoppable. And when the final blow came, when the spear pierced through flesh already burning with poison, his roar did not echo as a victory cry but as something else entirely, something that carried across distance, across bond, across fate itself. And in the heart of Obsidian Keep, Gwendolen felt it, not as a sound, but as pain, sharp and consuming,
ripping through her chest with a force that dropped her to her knees, her breath stolen, her vision
blurring as something ancient stirred within her, something that had been waiting, watching, growing in silence. And in that moment, everything she had been told about herself, every lie she had believed, every weakness she had accepted, shattered under the weight of a truth she could no longer deny, because the bond between them was not fragile, it was absolute, and it was calling her,
pulling her toward him with a force that could not be resisted. And so she did not hesitate, did not question,
did not allow fear to root her in place. She moved, driven by instinct, by something deeper than thought, something that guided her beyond the walls of the keep, beyond the guards who tried to stop her, beyond the life she had known, and into the storm itself. And when she reached the battlefield, what she found was not a king, not a legend, but a man on the edge of death, pinned to the snow, his strength fading,
his enemies closing in with the confidence of those who believed they had already
won. And standing among them were the faces she had once called family, their expressions twisted with triumph, with cruelty, with the same disregard that had condemned her once before. And something inside her broke, not gently, not quietly, but violently, completely, because this was not just betrayal, this was repetition, this was the past reaching forward to claim the future, and she refused, utterly refused, to let it happen again. And in that refusal, her wolf did not awaken, it erupted, tearing free from the chains that had bound it for 20 years, a force so powerful it reshaped the very air around her. And where once stood a girl who had been dismissed as weak, as broken, as nothing, now rose something ancient, something terrifying, something that commanded the world itself to take notice, her form shifting not into the expected but into something far greater, a colossal silver wolf, radiant beneath the storm, her presence crushing, undeniable, absolute. And the battle that followed was not a fight, it was a reckoning, swift and brutal and final, because she did not hesitate, did not falter. She moved through them like a force of nature, unstoppable, unrelenting, tearing down everything that stood between her and the one she had come to protect. And when at last she stood before her brothers, their fear laid bare, their arrogance shattered, she did not grant them mercy, because mercy had never been given to her. And with a final, decisive strike, she ended the bloodline that had once discarded her, not out of vengeance alone, but out of necessity, out of the understanding that some things, once broken beyond redemption, cannot be allowed to remain. And when the silence finally returned, when the storm seemed to pause in the wake of her power, she shifted back, her strength draining, her body collapsing into the snow, and it was there that Alaric found her, dragging himself forward despite the poison, despite the pain, gathering her into his arms, as if she were both his salvation and his greatest fear. And in that moment, everything changed, because the girl he had found in chains was gone, replaced by something that even the oldest legends had not fully captured. And when the royal guard arrived, when the elders saw what remained of the battlefield, saw the bodies, the destruction, the undeniable proof of what she was, doubt was no longer an option, because power like that could not be questioned, only acknowledged, only respected, and only feared. And so when they returned to Obsidian Keep, it was not as king and rescued prisoner, but as something else entirely, something equal, something bound not just by fate but by strength, by choice, by something forged in the space between survival and transformation. And in the days that followed, the kingdom shifted, not through force, but through acceptance, because the truth had been made undeniable. And Gwendolen, once the girl sold for grain, took her place beside the throne not as a symbol of mercy, but as a queen in her own right. Her rule shaped not by the cruelty she had endured, but by the strength she had claimed, and under her and Alaric, the North did not fall into chaos as some had feared, it thrived,
united under a balance that had never existed before. And the story of the girl who had been discarded became something else, something far greater, a legend, a reminder that power does not always come from where the world expects it, and that sometimes the ones deemed weakest are simply waiting for the right moment to become unstoppable. And if you've made it this far, if you've followed Gwendolyn's journey from nothing to everything, then you already understand the truth at the heart of this story, so don't just leave it here. Take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you felt during this story, because there are more legends waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss what comes next.